Next up, we have Lauren Rother talking about best practices.
Hi. Oh, I can hear myself. It's a bit disturbing. Sorry for the technical complications. We try. So I'm Lauren Rother, like she just said, unique. I'm a tech writer at Puppet Labs, in case you thought that I just stole this from somebody for fun. I've been there for a year and a half, and despite what the slide might indicate, I'm not actually a sloth or an astronaut. And I've heard, from the other presentations, I think that all the slots I have already been used. I blame Google. So I write with the Puppet Forge, which is where users find, share, and contribute to modules for Puppet software. And as the Forge and Puppet Labs have grown, our users have begun to ask us for our recommended ways of doing various tasks. And today I'm going to walk you through my trial and error process of writing my very first best practices documentation for modules on the Forge. And I'm going to highlight what I learned about writing best practices. So best practices for best practices, if you will. There's a few things I'm taking as standard. RFC language guide, I'll link to that at the end. I went into this using that, which is all the very must, should not, must not, strongly recommend. And I sort of take that as foundational for best practices. And it's also worth noting that the docs team falls under engineering at Puppet Labs. And we're all embedded in our various teams. So when I'm using we, I say that because I created these docs with the module engineers. It's a joint project. We have a really incredible set of users at Puppet Labs. They're really engaged, they're curious, and they're super bright. And because of this, we previously, or largely leave it to them to sort of find what they need in our documentation and apply it as they need to their own environments and workflows based on their setup. And the challenge of prescriptive docs like best practices is that users have different needs in different environments and different workflows, but they also have different levels of experience. So we need a document that accounts for all of those differences while still being helpful and setting an actual standard for behavior. So modules themselves, which is the beginner's guide to modules, this is what I wrote. Modules are self-contained bundles of code that express the model of your infrastructure with Puppet. And on the Forge, most modules are built to integrate or manage something like Apache or SSH. So we decided to write our documents, our best practices documents at user levels. So the beginner's guide to modules was first, and then we're in the process of writing an advanced guide to modules right now, taking what we learned in the beginner's guide to modules. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So on to the experiment. You may or may not be able to read this. It's not necessarily worth reading. This is the first draft of the beginner's guide to modules that we came up with. And these are screenshots from Google Docs history, so that's why it's in weird colors. Things are crossed out. For the first draft, one of the module engineers and I thought about all of the questions we'd seen on IRC and on the mailing list and the things that we'd heard from people who go out and teach classes in the field. And we kind of brain dumped everything into a Google Doc. And so we had this giant pile of text. And I went through that giant pile of text and I organized it and sorted it into sections. And I came up with 4 sections that I organized in order of how a user would need to approach modules. So there's, sorry, I have a brain. Structuring a module, testing a module, versioning a module, and releasing a module. And that seems to follow the basic workflow that we're encouraging everyone to use. And in the first draft, we took a page from textbook style writing, which is that we wanted to present heaps of information that every person who's going to have foundational knowledge in modules would need to know. So very much like this is your history class in 7th grade. And one of the things that became immediately apparent is that the document was way too overwhelming. Even organized into parts, there's way too much dense content. And most of that content ended up being really front-loaded into that first section, which took the utility out of separating it into sections to begin with. And it was never so apparent how unwieldy the document was until I went to edit it. Because as I'm going back, and I wrote it, as I'm going back, I'm getting lost in my own writing and having a really hard time tracking the flow. So when I was thinking about a user trying to read through that and follow it to create a module, I realized that these dense paragraphs full of information are really difficult to sink your teeth into. And it's hard to get your bearings when you're in the middle of it. And this particularly if you want to skip around or put it down and come back to it later. So we thought about orientation. And the first thing that we needed was to create signposts in each section and also create subsections to indicate what's going to be covered in the paragraphs that a user is about to approach. So I achieved this by creating section headings and subsection headings, as well as introductory sentences in each section. And these really short introductory sentences allow readers to orient themselves within the document at any given point, meaning that you could kind of stop and get out of it and come back as time permitted and not get hopelessly lost or off track, or at least that was the idea. The intro sentences were also intended to allow a user to move through the sections with purpose, so that you could look back and say, well, I was supposed to know how to scope a module in this section. Do I know how to do that? Did I do that in my own module? We'd initially excluded this introductory content on purpose. We thought that it would be wasted effort, like overly verbose, extra baggage kind of docs. But what we realized was that orienting a user with introductory sentences and headings I think are obvious, but introductory sentences was less obvious. They have a really important function in that they create an accessibility for readers on a couple of different levels. They allow a brand new reader who may not have had experience with your docs or with modules, for instance, to come in and kind of immediately figure out where they are in relationship to that document, as well as giving more experienced readers something to direct them where they need to go really quickly without requiring them to put in a lot of work. So, the second iteration, still not super worth reading, don't worry about it. Headings, yay, introductory sentences, some filler, where you can see we needed to fill in a section and hadn't yet. And as I was adding these headings and these introductory sentences, I also got a chance to clean up the paragraphs to be less dense while still being really content rich, and also it allowed me to break big paragraphs into smaller paragraphs to be more approachable, and thinking about orienting the user really helped me to do that. That's also known as editing. We talked a little bit about that yesterday, other people did. So yeah, so this is looking much better than that first just text monstrosity that was there before. But still, it was a really difficult doc. Even with the settings and the subheadings, smaller paragraphs, introductory sentences, the document was still really difficult to navigate. You couldn't put it down and pick it back up and not only know where you were, but also where you had been. And you didn't have a sense of where you came from. So it would require you to constantly go back, and this was something that I had to do as I was editing it, and if I'm doing it, a user is going to have an extraordinarily hard time with it. So given that the point is to walk someone through creating their own module, which necessitates that they're not reading this straight through, we realized that it's not functioning the way that we intended it to. And if you wanted to know something specific, like for instance, ordering classes in a module, there was no way in the doc that we had to find that really quickly and assess whether it was there or not. So in short, the doc that we had was really readable, but not usable. And it was at this point in our process that I realized we're writing a treatise more than a guidebook. And that if we really wanted to be successful at creating something that would help a user not only build a good module, but build good habits, we needed to approach this from a less overly academic standpoint. You may or may not notice from this little bit, I was a philosophy major in college, so I have no history of being overly wordy at all. And when I was thinking about this, about how we were writing a treatise and not a guidebook, I remembered this like flash from when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I decided that I would read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and I'll leave it up to you to decide what that says about me, but at a certain point in that book, I stopped reading it because I was enjoying it and I found it interesting and started reading it as a challenge. So it became something that I was like, I can say that I read this, but I'll never pick it up again. And I started to realize that that's the document we were writing, that this would be something that people would be like, I read that, and not something that they wanted to come back to. And it's super important for us to have a document, and best practices, it's super important that they be documents that people want to look at more than once, that they feel good about coming back to, and that they feel like they can share, rather than something that we're giving them to slog through. So, when I thought about it more, I realized we could only achieve that with steps. And in hindsight, this is really obvious. Like especially when we've seen a lot of presentations, steps are important. This had not occurred to me when we first started. Step-by-step guides are everywhere, even in early 90s pop songs. I have a dance to this song, so I'm not gonna do it, but I do. And the step-by-step guide, when we were thinking about it, and when I brought this up to the engineers, because when you're informing a user, it's very serious, and we were like, step-by-step guides. But when I was talking about it, I was like, this will build on the orientation work that we've done. Step-by-step guides will amplify our ability to position people in the document and allow them to move up and down through it as they need to. And it also it brings them into our world of modules and allows them to track their progress there, and feel good about that progress. So like, for instance, what if you don't have to go back to step 1 anymore because you've got that down? It'd be nice for someone to have that measurement. And it makes it really easy to put the doc down and pick it back up again. So this is this is a snippet of the final version that's up on the internet. I have a link to it at the end. So it has it all. It has steps, which you can kind of see up there and see in one of the headings. It has headings, it has introductory sentences, and bonus to having steps, really easy to write a table of contents. And the table of contents itself, really nice overview of what the document's gonna do. And interestingly, putting the guide into steps in the first place really made us add more examples, because as we realized that we were moving from step 1 to step 2 or sub-steps, each one could use a code snippet in a way that 80 words wouldn't cover in the same way. And examples are a tenet of best practices that I can't emphasize enough, particularly when dealing with something that can be done in multiple ways, like making modules. Also, the examples, there's a lot of, this is a screenshot mostly of the top so that you could see part of the table of contents, but in a document that's like this, trying to be on one big page, code snippets and examples and snazzy diagrams allow you to break up the monotony of text that can just get really overwhelming for a user. And I would call the diagram in this document snazzy, except that I think our UX department would kill me because I made it in omnigraphal, and you may or may not have noticed, but I'm not a graphic designer at all. And so, yeah, but they've fixed it for me, technically. But they still, I got a note about how if I ever need help, they're happy to help me. I grew up with MS Paint, right? Simple lines. But nothing's perfect, least of all when I'm looking at it. So while we're really excited about the document we released and we think it's awesome, I couldn't help but think about it and the future docs and what we could do to be better. And the one thing about the Beginner's Guide to Module is that it's really too high level. I mean, it works really well for what it is. It needs to be an introduction to the creation of basic modules, but it starts to skip out on the questions that come up when you're writing more complex modules, and that happens really, really quickly. For instance, why create 2 separate install classes for client and server rather than putting client and server installs in a single install class? There is a reason, I'm not going to go into it, it's kind of boring, but that question would come up pretty quickly, and the Beginner's Guide doesn't really answer that. So one of the things we're really working on in the advanced guide to modules is a far more in-depth explanation of why decisions are made. And what's been really awesome about these explanations is that they're really phenomenal for illuminating the complex and complicated mental work that has to go into making a module. And it kind of helps you orient yourself into what it takes to make a module that works well, but also will scale and version up. Because a lot of the point of putting a module on the Puppet Forge is so that people can contribute to it. And if it's not structured in a way that's actually accessible to the whole community, it's gonna be a lot harder to get people to contribute. And that's kind of what the Forge is all about. So yeah. How I got to the logic, which I feel the need to defend slightly, there was a moment when we worried that adding too much logic would make the document too wordy. But what I found was we actually tightened up our writing by really walking through the steps of me being either, depending on how you want to look at it, a toddler or Socrates, going, why? Why are we doing it that way? And why are we doing it this way? And why would you put this here instead of there? And asking all of those questions made us really get to the heart of what we wanted people to be doing in best practices with modules. And this is true with other best practices. So where we're going, the advanced guide to modules, I can't actually show you yet, it's a mess. But it has a lot more explanation in it. We also broke it up into pages. The beginner's guide to modules is this really long document, and the advanced guide actually separates out classes into its own page, and testing into its own page, and types into its own page, which allows us to give more examples and give more direction. And also, because I kept asking for these really annoying examples, our engineers decided that the best thing to do would be to build a module that you can follow along in the best practices doc, which is kind of the best thing ever because now our doc links to GitHub, and you can actually track the progression of the module in code as you're working. So at the end of the advanced guide to modules, you will have a functioning, I believe we went with SSH, you'll have a functioning SSH module. When you're completed, which I think is nice. This is a fancy link to my beginner's guide to modules, if you want to read it. This is the link to the language guide, which we're using throughout the advanced guide to modules and every other best practices doc that we write. And with that, if you have any questions, that's my slot.
Cool, we can do 1 or 2 questions. Anybody?
Hi, so I was wondering if you could talk about if you have any feedback from your experience, like at what point it was user-facing or if you had people actually looking at it and giving you responses that weren't just your coworkers or people who were otherwise working on documentation or on the development?
Right. I'm actually really glad you asked about that because I wanted to talk about it, but decided that maybe it would be out of scope. So we had a really, originally it was a couple of engineers and I, we put together the document, and then we released it in the team, in the Forge team. We got their feedback, and then we cleaned it up. So the second iteration actually got seen by, I think, all of the engineers at Puppet Labs. We sent it out to the tech mailing list, and whoever had time read it. And then when we had that, when I had incorporated that feedback, we actually released it to certain members of the community. We put it in a public-facing Google Doc that wasn't editable and just sent it out to our top contributors and the people who are really active in IRC around modules, and we got them, I don't know why I'm looking behind me as though it has an answer, but we had a lot of feedback that way, and it was really, really great. And then we released it in a Google Doc to the Puppet community at PuppetConf last year. So throughout PuppetConf, I got to have conversations with people about what they did and didn't like about the Beginner's Guide to Modules, and then we published it on the site, and that was actually a really great process of getting kind of structured feedback in ramped up levels.
Cool, I think we're out of time. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks.